My father-in-law bribed the transplant board. My son died, waiting while his nephew got bumped ahead. You paid them to move Levi ahead of my son? I screamed, slamming the bank statements onto Douglas's mahogany desk. $350,000 to the charitable foundation run by the transplant director's wife. Keep your voice down, Hannah, my father-in-law hissed, his eyes darting toward the French doors of his study. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. My voice cracked as tears streamed down my face. While my son took his last breath in that hospital bed, your precious nephew was in surgery getting the organ that should have saved Lucas. Family comes first, Douglas said, straightening his silk tie. Levi is my brother's son. Lucas was your grandson. I felt my knees buckle and I gripped the edge of his desk. My baby is dead because of what you did. My father-in-law bribed the transplant board. My son died waiting while his nephew got bumped ahead. Hi, I'm Hannah. Today I'm going to tell you my story, but before I continue, please like, share, and subscribe to hear more stories like this. 3 years ago, my life was beautifully simple. I taught 4th grade at Riverside Elementary in Asheville, North Carolina. My husband, David, worked as a structural engineer at his father's prestigious architecture firm, Harrington and Associates. Our son, Lucas, was a brilliant, energetic 9-year-old who loved astronomy, built intricate model rockets, and could recite facts about every planet in our solar system. We lived in a cozy 2-story colonial in a quiet suburb, not extravagant, but it was home. David's family had wealth, generations of it, but we'd deliberately chosen a more modest lifestyle. We wanted Lucas to appreciate hard work over inherited privilege. This created constant friction with my father-in-law, Douglas Harrington, who couldn't fathom why his son rejected the lifestyle he'd built. You're depriving my grandson of his birthright, Douglas would declare during mandatory Sunday dinners at his estate in the historic district. We're teaching our son values, I'd counter, while David would squeeze my hand beneath the linen tablecloth, silently pleading for peace. The Harringtons had dominated Asheville society for 4 generations. Douglas served on hospital boards, funded university buildings, and had the mayor's personal cell number. His wife, Catherine, had died when David was in graduate school, leaving Douglas to become increasingly controlling of his only son and, by extension, our small family. His brother, William, David's uncle, was equally imperious. William's son, Levi, was a year older than Lucas. The cousins got along well enough during family gatherings, though Levi had inherited his father's entitled attitude, expecting doors to open simply because he was a Harrington. Our carefully built life shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when Lucas came home from school too exhausted to finish his homework. Within 10 days, he was hospitalized with fevers that wouldn't respond to medication. The diagnosis felt like a death sentence. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a rare and aggressive form. The following months became an endless nightmare of sterile hospital rooms, brutal chemotherapy sessions, bone marrow biopsies, and watching our vibrant son transform into a pale shadow of himself. David took an extended leave from the firm. I resigned from teaching. Every moment centered on Lucas's care and comfort. Douglas immediately assumed financial control, covering every medical expense insurance wouldn't touch. No grandson of mine will lack the finest care available, he announced, as if money could cure cancer. Initially, the treatment worked. Lucas's oncologist, Dr. Morrison, remained cautiously optimistic. He's young and his overall health is good, that's in his favor. Then came the relapse. Aggressive, devastating, with only one viable option remaining, a stem cell transplant. We need to find a donor, Dr. Morrison explained, her kind eyes clouded with concern. Siblings provide the best matches, but since Lucas is an only child, we'll test extended family members. David and I weren't compatible. Parents rarely are. Douglas volunteered immediately, but at 74, he wasn't medically suitable. We expanded the search to everyone. David's cousins, my siblings, distant relatives, anyone who might share enough genetic markers. By terrible coincidence, that same week, Levi, now 10 years old, was rushed to Duke University Hospital with acute kidney failure. Some rare autoimmune disorder had attacked without warning, destroying both kidneys within days. He was placed on dialysis and immediately added to the transplant waiting list. 2 cousins, 2 life-threatening conditions, 2 families in crisis. The Harrington family mobilized around both boys. Family members underwent testing as potential donors for both children. William and his wife, Stephanie, maintained a vigil at Duke while David and I lived at Mission Hospital. Douglas shuttled between both facilities, checkbook perpetually open, attempting to solve problems the only way he understood, with money. For Lucas, we found a partial match in my younger brother, Greg. Not ideal, but Dr. Morrison believed it could succeed. The rejection risk is higher, she warned, but given Lucas's deteriorating condition, I strongly recommend proceeding. We scheduled the transplant for 6 weeks out, the earliest possible date considering the intensive preparation required. Lucas would need aggressive chemotherapy to eliminate his remaining diseased bone marrow before receiving Greg's healthy cells. Meanwhile, Levi was placed on the kidney transplant waiting list. His blood type was B positive, common enough that finding a deceased donor match seemed feasible, though the timeline remained uncertain. Neither parent is compatible for living donation, Douglas reported after William and Stephanie were tested. The doctors estimate 3 to 6 months for a deceased donor, sometimes longer. Douglas's expression darkened at this news. That's unacceptable, he said quietly. There must be alternatives we can explore. 1 week later, while Lucas was undergoing his brutal pre-transplant chemotherapy regimen, we received shocking news. Levi had been matched with a kidney. The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. It's a miracle, Stephanie told me through tears during a frantic phone call. They said an excellent match from a deceased donor just became available yesterday. I felt genuine happiness for them. Despite the complicated family dynamics and Douglas's controlling nature, Levi was an innocent child who deserved health and life. That's wonderful news, I told Stephanie sincerely. Please keep us updated on the surgery. Lucas, weakened from chemotherapy but still my brave little fighter, insisted on making a get-well card for Levi. I know he's probably scared, Lucas said, carefully drawing 2 boys, one with a new kidney, one with new blood cells. I'll see him at Thanksgiving when we're both better. That homemade card, Lucas's hopeful vision of their shared future, would haunt me for years afterward. 4 days after Levi's successful transplant surgery, Lucas spiked a dangerous fever. Dr. Morrison ordered extensive testing that confirmed our worst nightmare. A rare aggressive bacterial infection had taken hold in his chemotherapy-weakened body. We need to postpone the transplant, she said, her voice heavy with regret. His immune system cannot handle the procedure while fighting this infection. The delay stretched from days into weeks as Lucas battled the relentless infection. The chemotherapy had already destroyed his bone marrow, leaving him with virtually no natural defenses. He was transferred to an isolation unit, his room transformed into a sterile prison where David and I could only visit wearing full protective gear, masks, gowns, gloves. By the time the infection finally cleared, Lucas had deteriorated significantly. Dr. Morrison remained determined but deeply concerned. The window for transplant is narrowing rapidly, she admitted, but I still believe it's our best option. We scheduled the procedure again, clinging desperately to hope. 3 days before the rescheduled transplant, Lucas's heart stopped during routine morning vitals. The medical team revived him after 7 terrifying minutes. But the episode caused neurological damage. He was placed on a ventilator, unresponsive but still fighting. Dr. Morrison delivered the devastating news that shattered our world. The transplant is no longer medically viable. I'm so deeply sorry, but Lucas's body simply cannot withstand the procedure now. David collapsed into the chair beside Lucas's bed, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I stood frozen, unable to process her words, unable to accept that we had exhausted all medical options. How long? I finally whispered. Days, she said softly. Perhaps a week at most. Lucas held on for 6 agonizing days. We never left his side. reading his favorite books about space exploration, playing his favorite music, telling him how incredibly brave he was, how deeply loved. On the final morning, with his small hand in mine, I felt his pulse flutter weakly, then fade to nothing. My beautiful boy was gone. The funeral passed in a fog. I remember the impossibly small casket, David's hollow eyes staring at nothing, Douglas's rigid formality as he wrote checks for funeral expenses, as if money could somehow compensate for what a grandfather should have provided. Levi attended in a wheelchair, still recovering but improving steadily. I couldn't look at him, not from resentment, but because his healthy complexion was too painful a contrast to Lucas's absence. Grief consumed everything. David returned to work after 5 weeks, burying himself in architectural blueprints and client meetings. Anything to avoid the emptiness at home. I couldn't face my classroom full of 9-year-olds, couldn't bear their innocent questions about my long absence. I took extended leave, then eventually resigned permanently. Our marriage buckled under the crushing weight of shared loss. David and I moved through our house like ghosts, carefully avoiding Lucas's room with its glow-in-the-dark star stickers and model rocket collection. We couldn't bring ourselves to pack it away, but we couldn't confront it directly either. The only thing that pulled me from the depths of despair was a nagging inconsistency my grief-clouded mind couldn't initially process. Something about Levi's miraculous transplant match didn't add up. 7 months after Lucas's death, during a family dinner I attended only because David practically begged me, William casually mentioned that Levi's kidney had come from a 21-year-old motorcycle accident victim from Charlotte. "Perfect match, perfect timing," he said, raising his wine glass in a toast to continued health. "What was the timing exactly?" I asked, the first words I'd spoken all evening. "When precisely did you receive the call about the match?" Stephanie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "It was a Thursday evening, 4 days after Levi was officially placed on the list." 4 days. The average wait time for B-positive blood types was typically 3 to 6 months, sometimes longer. Yet Levi had received an excellent match in 4 days. "That seems remarkably unusual," I said carefully. "The Harrington luck," Douglas interjected smoothly, his eyes meeting mine across the elegant dining table. "Our family has always been fortunate in critical moments." Something in his expression, a fleeting shadow of guilt quickly concealed, sparked the first genuine emotion I'd experienced in months: deep suspicion. After dinner, I cornered Douglas in his wood-paneled study under the pretense of discussing a memorial scholarship fund for Lucas. "Levi's transplant," I said without preamble, closing the study door behind me. 4 days on the waiting list is far more than luck. "I don't know what you're implying, Hannah," Douglas replied, though his hand trembled slightly as he poured expensive scotch into a crystal tumbler. "I think you know exactly what I'm implying. Lucas was already scheduled for his stem cell procedure when Levi magically received a perfect match. These are completely separate medical situations, Hannah. Don't let grief cloud your judgment. Don't let your conscience trouble you too much." I shot back, turning toward the door. His next words stopped me cold. "Everything I've ever done has been for this family." I turned slowly. "What exactly did you do, Douglas?" He didn't answer, but his silence confirmed everything. I left without another word, a terrible certainty taking root in my chest. The next morning, I contacted Natalie Brooks, a nurse who had become a friend during Lucas's long hospitalizations. She worked in transplant coordination at Mission Hospital, though not specifically with kidney patients. "Is there any way," I asked carefully over coffee at a quiet cafe downtown, "that someone could influence the transplant waiting list, move a patient up ahead of others?" Natalie's expression immediately darkened. "Officially, absolutely not. The system is designed to be completely objective. Medical urgency, time on the waiting list, compatibility factors, all carefully weighted." "And unofficially?" I pressed. She hesitated, stirring her latte nervously. "There have been persistent rumors over the years, large donations coinciding with fortunate timing for certain patients. Nothing ever proven, but whispers nonetheless. If someone wanted to investigate and potentially prove it," she continued cautiously, You'd need a substantial paper trail, documentation of donations, transplant committee minutes, precise timing of match notifications. She studied my face carefully. Hannah, what is this really about? I told her everything. My suspicions about Douglas, the impossible timing, the convenient match. To her credit, Natalie didn't dismiss my concerns as grief-induced paranoia. Instead, she provided a name, Lawrence Bennett, a healthcare compliance investigator who specialized in medical ethics violations and transplant irregularities. Lawrence was initially skeptical when I contacted him. "Don't get your hopes up, Mrs. Harrington," he warned during our first phone conversation. "These situations are nearly impossible to prove without insider information or documented evidence." For the next 6 weeks, I functioned on autopilot at home while pouring every ounce of energy into the investigation. David noticed the change in me but attributed it to finally processing our devastating loss. I couldn't tell him my suspicions about his father, not without concrete proof. Lawrence called on a cold November afternoon. "I need to meet with you in person," he said, his voice tight with barely contained tension. We met at a coffee shop in Hendersonville, well outside the Harrington family sphere of influence. He slid a manila folder across the scarred wooden table. "I found something," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure privacy. Inside was documentation of a $350,000 donation from a Harrington-controlled shell corporation to a small charitable foundation run by the transplant committee director's wife. The donation was dated 2 days before Levi received his match notification. "This isn't definitive legal proof," Lawrence cautioned, "but the timing is extraordinarily suspicious, especially considering that 3 patients with more medically urgent cases in Levi's blood type were bypassed that same week." My hands trembled violently as I closed the folder, rage and grief warring inside me. "What are my options now?" "You could present this to the hospital ethics board or even law enforcement authorities," he said. "But the Harringtons have substantial resources and powerful connections throughout the state. It would essentially be your word against theirs." He paused. "And Mrs. Harrington, your son is gone. No outcome changes that terrible reality." "This isn't about changing the past," I said, feeling cold clarity wash over me. "This is about justice, for Lucas and for every other family still waiting while people like Douglas manipulate the system." The next step was the hardest, confronting David with the evidence. I showed him everything that night after a silent dinner, bracing for disbelief, anger, or outright denial. Instead, he sat motionless for long minutes, staring at the documents, then finally whispered, "I've always known my father was capable of pulling strings behind the scenes. But this..." His voice broke completely. "Lucas might still be alive." "We can't know that with certainty," I said, though we both understood the terrible possibility. If Douglas hadn't intervened, if the transplant system had functioned as ethically designed, would a different family be grieving instead of ours? David's expression hardened with determination. "What do you want to do?" "I want the complete truth from him, on record." We drove to Douglas's estate that night, unannounced. He was clearly surprised to see us, especially David, who had been avoiding all family gatherings since Lucas's funeral. In his study, I placed the folder deliberately on his antique desk. "Tell us exactly what you did, Douglas." Douglas glanced at the folder's contents, his expression shifting from confusion to calculated concern. "Where did you obtain this?" "Does it matter?" David's voice was ice cold. "We know about the donation to the foundation, the timing. 4 days, Douglas. 4 days on the waiting list when others had been waiting months or years." "You paid them to prioritize Levi ahead of my son!" I screamed, all composure shattering. $350,000 to the transplant director's wife's foundation. "Lower your voice, Hannah," Douglas hissed, glancing nervously toward the hallway. "You fundamentally don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I shouted back. While Lucas took his last breath, Levi was in surgery, receiving an organ that should have gone to someone more medically urgent. "Family comes first." Douglas's face flushed red. "Levi is my brother's son. Lucas was your grandson." David stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "My son is dead because of what you did. I did not cause Lucas's death." Douglas insisted. His medical condition was far more complicated, multiple complications. Don't you dare, David interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. Don't you dare discuss my son's condition like you're some medical expert. You interfered with a system designed to save lives based on medical necessity, not family connections or wealth. I made a charitable donation, Douglas countered defensively. Hospitals desperately need private funding. You made a bribe, I corrected coldly, and we can prove it. I recorded this entire conversation on my phone. Fear flashed across Douglas's face. What do you want? Money? I'll establish a foundation in Lucas's name, fund an entire wing at the Children's Hospital. We want justice, David said firmly. For Lucas, for the other families still desperately waiting while people like you manipulate the system for personal benefit. Douglas's expression hardened. Be reasonable about this. Taking this public helps absolutely no one. The publicity would devastate William and Levi, your own family, and frankly, you have no concrete proof of actual wrongdoing. The recording and my testimony would be enough. We left Douglas's house with his threats echoing behind us. He would disown David. He would systematically destroy my reputation. He would ensure we regretted this foolish crusade. The next morning, we presented our evidence to the State Medical Board, the Hospital Ethics Committee, and an investigative journalist known for healthcare corruption exposés. Within a week, an official inquiry was launched. The scandal affected everyone. The transplant director was placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. The charitable foundation underwent comprehensive auditing. William and Stephanie were devastated to learn that Levi's life-saving surgery had potentially come at the expense of more medically urgent patients. Levi himself, now 11, was traumatized by the revelation. Does this mean they'll take the kidney back? He asked his parents in a moment of heartbreaking confusion. The investigation confirmed everything. Douglas had not only made the donation, but had leveraged his hospital board position to pressure the transplant committee. The director admitted that Douglas had specifically mentioned losing one grandson already as justification for prioritizing Levi. Criminal charges followed. Bribery, conspiracy, ethics violations. Douglas's reputation, the thing he valued above everything else, was destroyed overnight. The prestigious Harrington name became synonymous with corruption and privilege run amok. Local news covered it extensively. National media picked up the story as an example of systemic healthcare inequality. David resigned from his father's firm and established his own small architecture practice, specializing in affordable housing projects, a deliberate rejection of everything Douglas represented. We sold our house, too saturated with painful memories, and moved to a different neighborhood in West Asheville. Not running away, but creating essential space for healing. The most difficult conversation was with William and Stephanie. We genuinely didn't know, William insisted, and I believed him. We were so focused on Levi's survival, we never questioned the timing or circumstances. Would you have questioned it if you'd had suspicions? I asked directly. His painful silence was answer enough. Levi's kidney function remained stable throughout the scandal. The medical consensus was that removing a successfully transplanted organ would be unethical, regardless of how he'd originally received it. He would live with the knowledge, but not the physical consequence. Other families affected, those who had been bypassed on the waiting list, received financial settlements. The transplant system underwent significant reforms to prevent future manipulation. Enhanced oversight, mandatory disclosure of all donations, independent review boards. Douglas pleaded guilty in exchange for exposing broader corruption in the regional transplant network. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.3 million fine. The punishment seemed inadequate for the lives affected, the trust destroyed. But it was something tangible. David and I attended therapy together, slowly rebuilding our relationship from the ruins of shared grief. We learned to talk about Lucas without completely falling apart, to celebrate his memory rather than just mourn his absence. A year after Douglas's conviction, we established the Lucas Harrington Memorial Scholarship for children pursuing STEM education. funded not by Harrington money but by contributions from our community and my return to teaching part-time. I still think about that homemade card Lucas made for Levi. His innocent belief that they'd both recover and celebrate together. That simple hope, destroyed by corruption and privilege, drives me forward. The system isn't perfect now. Wealth still opens doors that should remain closed, but there's more transparency, more accountability, more people willing to ask uncomfortable questions. Levi occasionally sends messages through Stephanie. Apologies he doesn't owe, guilt he shouldn't carry. I've told him that none of this was his fault. He was an innocent child caught in his grandfather's corruption. Some family relationships have been permanently severed. Douglas and I will never speak again. But David has slowly rebuilt connections with William, both men bonded by betrayal and loss. If you discovered someone had abused their power and wealth to benefit themselves at the expense of others, would you pursue justice even if it meant tearing your family apart? What price is too high for doing what's right? For me, the answer became clear in Lucas's hospital room, holding his hand as he took his final breath. Justice for him, for every family still waiting, for the integrity of a system designed to save lives fairly. That was worth any personal cost. My son didn't die in vain. His story changed the system. That has to be enough.